tweet. It's pretty short, from Murtaza Hussein, who writes at The Intercept. And he says, I still consider the high watermark of what felt like fascism in the United States, the Bush-Cheney years. Extrajudicial disappearances, state-sanctioned torture, expanding list of wars, most of the media transformed into cheerleading zombies. Nothing compares with that. And this is, I think it's interesting because like I take his point and I think he's raising something interesting, which is that like Bush-Cheney was like way more dystopian and terrifying than I think we often remember, because the aesthetic of Trump was so anti-democratic and like so in your face about it. And their Bush-Cheney aggression, fascism was like, had this like veneer of civility over the top of it that made it more digestible, particularly if you were like a certain kind of person, you know. And if you were a Muslim or somebody who looked Muslim-ish, you were probably feeling like what Murtaza is saying, which is that like that's the high water mark of fascism. You know, you go to your mosque and the FBI is surveilling you and wiretapping you, and like people really were disappearing and thrown into jails and shit. So like the apparatus of like a kind of totalitarian state was being constructed in gangbusters under Bush and Cheney, but there wasn't a mass fascist movement in the Bush-Cheney years. The populist energy that was like pro-fascist, that is a thing now. That's something that like Trump like helped unlock. And the Bush-Cheney years didn't do anything to help that, you know, like you have the war on terror and then the war comes home, you know. But in the Bush-Cheney years, that populist fascist energy was just not quite present yet. So I appreciate, I don't know if I fully agree with the statement that like Bush-Cheney was more fascist than Trump, whatever his name was, Mike Pence. But there's definitely like a relationship there. And the tweets sparked off like a debate among people who were like generally like-minded, but disagreed with each other about this. I
I
thought,
think
yeah.
it's also interesting to look at the context of in both eras. Obviously, Bush Cheney, their sort of fascism was juxtaposed against 9/11, right, and caused this
Yeah.
mass paranoia. We lived in the U.S. at the time, and a lot of what were Indians, were not Muslim either, but a lot of that kind of
Like everybody
it,
confused Sikhs for Muslims, and yeah.
exactly. So we dealt with that, and then also in terms of the Trump Pence era, or the administration, it's juxtaposed on against this sort of increasingly marginalized middle class that isn't people of color. So
Mm,
like a white middle class that's marginalized by neoliberal economics and things like that,
yeah.
that is sort of coming to the forefront, which maybe was at its inception in the early noughts. And so it's really cool to sort of compare the two contexts within which the sort of fascism is happening, and see how they sort of manifest differently.
Yeah. There's a book by I want to say Thomas Oatley. In 2015 he wrote this, which is like in before times, but he basically argued that spending on military superiority, like running deficits, the way we've been doing it since the 80s, like where you run big deficits in order to pay for military superiority, that was actually a cause of recurring financial crisis. So every financial crisis that we've had since the 80s has been tracked, including the global financial crisis in '08, traces back to this need to like structurally sustain deficit spending through foreign borrowing to pay for military superiority, which is an interesting argument. And to the extent that that's correct, it's a Cambridge book, no less. But to the extent that that's correct, it's showing how like the war on terror apparatus creates the economic insecurity. You know, it exacerbates like neoliberalism basically. And so the over time that populist reactionary energy just like builds and builds. And then Trump was the great inheritor of that.